Hello everyone, welcome. Today we're going to take the time to discuss a game's community because it is arguably the most important aspect of a video game. Although the developers themselves cannot control the community, there are many different aspects of that community, how welcoming they are, how they treat newcomers that really affect the player base. With that being said, I've also taken answers and replies from individuals within my Discord server, so if you want to be featured in future videos or at least have your opinion mentioned, then feel free to join that. It will be linked down below, as well as in the comments section. With that being said, whilst I may be discussing communities as a whole, my most impactful experiences have been with the Tower Fantasy community, the Genshin Impact community, the Blue Archive and Arknights community, and some minor interaction with the Shanghai community. Keeping this in mind, something else to consider is that community experiences can be vastly different. You could have a terrible interaction, a terrible first impression, or an overall perspective of a community compared to me. And this could be due to which ways we interact with it, where we go to interact with that community, whether that be something like Reddit, Discord, etc. So please understand that a lot of these will be based off my experiences and the experiences of my server members who chose to reply, and it's not indicative of an entire community, just what we ourselves have experienced. With that being said, let's continue. One of the core aspects that in my opinion makes a community really nice to interact with and really welcoming is how they treat newcomers. Now I know this seems like a basic standpoint and that any community should be welcoming to newcomers, but it's not necessarily just being welcoming, it's about knowing how to introduce a new player to your game. A lot of times what you'll find is if you're a newcomer and maybe you haven't experienced something before, they're either sometimes will push you towards a specific meta which can drastically alter your perspective and your opinion of the game itself, or they will overload you with new information to such an extent to where you don't want to interact because you're already more confused than you started off with. This especially can happen with very bloated or very complex games. It can happen because much older players or individuals who are expected or told that they're a teacher in that instance already have so much information on that game that it's very difficult for them to explain that to a new player who has no knowledge whatsoever without it being overbearing or confusing. And this in turn translates to the fact that a lot of older players may be bad teachers. Even with that being said, that doesn't mean the community is bad, doesn't mean the individuals are bad. They may be bad teachers, they may be bad at introducing a newer player to certain concepts and aspects of the game, but it's not a bad thing. Overall, what I think makes a community really good, and in this example I will use Blue Archives, is if the game or the community itself is centered around similar topics, or alternatively have a similar mindset to one another. I think when you have large games that spiral out into different aspects, you have spin-offs of communities, and those communities themselves will fight and can argue with one another. An example is if you have a game that primarily does have a very specific meta team or meta composition in comparison to individuals who are much more heavily focused on story or waifu over meta. This is something that happens quite a lot in games like Genshin Impact, in which you have the current meta teams, which is either a national team, rational, etc., or specific meta units like Hu Tao, or very individual crowd DPSs like Ganyu or Ayaka. And this in turn creates issues for characters like Yoimiya or lesser valuable units in comparison to others. Because whilst the community centered around those units can be nice, the perspective of new players and new characters are oftentimes shifted, because if you're looking at characters like Yoimiya, because Hu Tao deals more damage than her, with arguably a harder or less difficult setup, what it means is that new players will constantly be told, don't roll for this character, don't roll for this character, instead wait for this, or instead this is the meta option, and because of that it can drastically alter a individual's perception of a community. Whereas with games like Blue Archive, because a lot of the community itself is centered around either the characters, the story, or the art of those characters, nobody really cares. And because a lot of individuals who are getting into the game like the designs of the units themselves or are interested in this story, a lot of individuals are much more inclined to just go about their way, like what they like, and move on. The community as a whole has a very similar mindset in that if you like a unit, whatever that unit may be or whatever that character may be, nobody is really going to chastise you for it. And you will find a very large group of like-minded individuals as well. It's why from a content creator perspective, I enjoy the Blue Archive community a lot more than other games. Even if the player base isn't super large and the game itself isn't super large to an extent to where I can cover a lot of it, there is such a varied amount of individuals that I do have a really high chance of meeting new people, with all of them having vaguely similar ideals or very similar interests to an extent to where it's very easy to find someone you get along with. And if you want to find someone you get along with and make a friend, hey, join my Discord server. But even with that being said, you can have games that have a meta, that have meta-focused individuals who are very, very into discovering what's the best teams, what are the best units overall, and who are the most valuable ones. I think Arknights, as of right now, can represent that pretty well. Even though Arknights at a time had a very similar fan base to Genshin Impact in that you did have a lot of arguing, a lot more drama here and there going on. The community has settled to an extent to where, as of right now, it's much easier to get in and find something you like, while also at the same time being a much more chill and calm community than it was previously. You're very inclined to find like-minded individuals, not only in terms of the characters you like, the story, and what you're interested in, but also in terms of meta. It's less focused and people are less inclined to try and shove a specific mindset or viewpoint down your throat. Now, communities can differ one way or another. You can have different perspectives. You can like a meta-focused community, and I'm not saying that those are incorrect. What I am saying is that if the individual new player, or if players who maybe left the game for a while come back to it, and the people they're meeting now are so inclined and so interested in solely pushing one specific style of play, or one specific thing down their throats to an extent to where it can dramatically alter their perspective of the game itself, then I think it becomes a problem. I think if you have a community that overall has different sectors, from meta to waifu over meta to story to lore to mechanics, that's perfectly fine. Having different sections is fine, but it's when those sections become overbearing to an extent to where they alter or in any way hinder a new player's experience, then it becomes an issue. Now, if you're a Genshin Impact player, you already know that the community for Genshin is a bit difficult to discuss. You have Genshin Twitter, which, let's be honest, is the cesspool of the Genshin community. It is the worst place in existence. I never go on Genshin Twitter other than ours, and even if I do, I'd rather just wait for Rule 34. But even with that being said, there are certain pockets that are really welcoming. The Genshin Impact official Discord server, it's terrible, don't go there. Instead, find a different server. Find the server of the mains of the characters that you like. Your Mia mains, for instance, could be a really nice community. I can't say for sure because I've never been there. But because Genshin is so large, you're likely to have much more negative experiences and much more positive experiences. Because of the size of the community, there's vast amounts of individuals and different pockets and different sections. Think about the fact that there are subreddits dedicated to each character, from Razor mains to Yelan mains to Zhongli mains, etc. Because of this, you are much more inclined to find a negative player and have a negative experience with them than you are to find, for instance, a negative player in Blue Archive. This is not saying that the game is worse or that the community is worse. This is to say that also because the community is so large, there's a much larger amount of negative players in Genshin than there are in Arknights and than there are in Honkai or Blue Archive. If a game's community can take a joke, if they can welcome new players, if they can decently explain the concept and mechanics of a game itself, that's a fine community. If your community or a game's community cannot in any way, shape, or form do one of those things, either that's welcoming a new player by giving them a decent experience and some nice knowledge going forward, assisting them in some way, or cannot take a joke to an extent to where they don't know how to interact with players who maybe aren't as experienced or just want to have fun, then in my opinion, that is indicative of a much bigger problem. Developers can't change their communities. Developers can't really help it, but they do understand and do know what appeals to their people. Blue Archive exemplifies this pretty well. I mean, look at the live 2Ds of the characters. You pretty comfortably know that each one's more or less caters to a specific interest or kink. Like, let's be honest here. But if we're talking about Genshin Impact, each one of those characters kind of has different playstyles, different art styles, different regions, and different personalities to an extent where it's very difficult to discuss. And the game's developers and the content creators don't exactly help this in any way. You have many who will, in some ways, spark drama between themselves or between each other. So I do think that you have a vast majority of games, and I do think that there are vast communities in those. You have the meta ones, you have the waifu meta ones, you have the lore-focused ones who write 30-page documents explaining the story and explaining the significance of each unit, and then you have the others. Whatever camp you're in, I want to hear your opinions in your communities. What games do you play? What people do you interact with? What have your experiences been? Have you had positive or negative ones? And have a good day. Join the Discord server if you're interested. Consider subscribing, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.